my personal foundation story, which hopefully we all have one.
Yeah.
Our own foundation story, our own Exodus experience, from darkness to light, as it was foundationally experienced in a living encounter and experience of God. Mm-hmm. So, this foundation story is part of our first love that we have to call to mind and remember, and recognizing that the story continues.
Yes.
But in terms of the first love and how that took place, how that was manifest and made flesh, it began with the key watershed moment.
Yes.
Was going to a parish mission, and I went. A lot had to have happened in my heart to even bring me to the point of being open to accept the invitation to go to this parish mission, because at that stage I was still very young. I was 19, but in my mind I had thought I figured it all out. And one of the things that I thought I figured out is that Christianity is bogus.
Wow.
And I was very much an active, truth seeker, fashioned myself as many people do, as spiritual but not religious.
Yeah.
Had an aversion towards organized religion, but very interested in spirituality and mysticism, but certainly not things that were Christian. And so for me to be open to accept this invitation to go to a parish mission, there was already a background story that the Lord was doing behind the scenes. But that moment was a watershed moment. And what really put my guard down, that allowed the Lord to begin to do what he alone can do to win us over.
Yeah.
Was the humanity of the priest.
Yes.
He just seemed like a very genuine, authentic man's man. And I mean man's man in the sense of like just a really good dude.
Yeah.
That was relatable.
Yeah.
And was down to earth, but you could see that there was depth to him. He wasn't superficial. There was a lot of substance to what he had to say. Mm-hmm. And I remember I was so impressed with him as a human being and his message resonated in what I had been looking for and found to be true, that from there the Lord began to speak in the secret hiding places of my innermost thoughts. And he began to speak to me according to my own language, according to a way that I would understand. And part of that wooing me over was saying to me, hey, kid, you fashion yourself as being unconventional and going against the tide and being your own person and not caring what other people think, and all this kind of pride of independence to be your own self. Well, why don't you do something really radical against the cultural norm and go back to church? And see what that's like on your own terms, and not because you have to, but just go back on your own terms. You drive now. Go, not because you're being forced as a family to go, but go and see what it's like. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of like the challenge in this whisper in my innermost thoughts. And I consented. I says, you know what? I'll check it out. And the Lord in his merciful love spared no time, because he just seized the moment, and it was going back to Mass, and it was a Novus Ordo Mass in a very run-of-the-mill Catholic parish.
I get it.
There was nothing spectacular about this parish in terms of its preaching or liturgy. There was nothing, there was nothing remarkable about this parish that would attract, a traditional Catholic to parishes as we know them today.
Yeah.
But that was no hindrance to the Lord.
No.
And as soon as I opened my heart to the context of the Mass, and I knew, of course, nothing about the Mass or the true presence. I just knew what I knew growing up as a kid and going through the motions. And going through the motions, and I don't blame, anybody. Certainly don't blame my parents and my family for that.
Right.
But it was just a cultural obligation and routine that my family had a lot of respect for, but I certainly didn't get it.
Yeah.
And like most children, I had, I think, a natural attraction to the things of God, but nothing too pronounced. I remember my mom asking me if I wanted to altar serve, and I had a repugnance to the thought of altar serving.
Wow.
Because for me, even as a 7 or 9 year old, it just felt like that's not cool. You know, I wanted more than anything. I wanted to be cool and accepted by my friends at school. And if any of them saw me up there, then, you know, then I might be just like dismissed from the in crowd or whatever. And so I had no attraction to the things of God, and there was no particular priest that inspired me. And I was ignorant of the basics of the faith or how to have a personal relationship with the Lord. Wow. So by the time I became a teenager, breathing the air of the culture,
yes, that's good.
The spirit of the air was very antithetical towards anything that would nourish authentic Christian life. And so I remember as a kid, whenever I felt like upset with my mother and my family, and that rebellious spirit starting to stir inside, I remember one of the first things before I became 18, maybe as young as a 13 or 14-year-old, saying to myself, as soon as I turn 18, I'm done with church.
Wow.
I'm done with this. I'm done with that. And you know, I'm gonna do me. And sure enough, it happened. And one of those kind of crystal clear moments and memories that I have is my grandmother, God bless her heart. A special memory that I have of bonding with her is when she gave me the image of the holy face of Jesus.
Really?
Yeah, and you're probably familiar with this image.
Of course.
It's one of those that have a miraculous origin. For example, it's not the Shroud of Turin. It's the risen Lord. But the story background, if I remember right, it was something like a woman from, I think, Puerto Rico went to a pilgrimage in the Holy Land. And when she got back home, there was this mysterious picture in her photos that she developed. And she never remembered taking this picture. And it was so mysteriously striking to her. It penetrated her soul and attracted this fire in her for the Lord. And she went back, she tried to investigate where did this picture come from. There was no natural origin of how it came about. And so it's been attributed as being, you know, semi-miraculous. And I still have that picture to this day. It's one of my favorite images of the Holy Face.
Incredible.
And I remember I always had that in my room. And so despite all the other stuff of the way of the world that was part of my identity that I had just as an artist, my whole room was just decked out with pictures and posters, and it was all reflecting our mentality, our lifestyle, you know, hip hop, graffiti art culture.
Is that right?
That was my, you know, who I was. And so all this graffiti art stuff and hip hop stuff from Source magazine and all the graffiti art magazines, all decked out, and right in the center, the holy face of Jesus on my dresser. So that image always stayed with me until this one moment where, as I started getting more into spirituality and less, and this anti-Christian spirit started to also develop inside of me. There came a point where I remember very deliberately taking that picture and putting it in the drawer.
Really?
And that was like me, like biblically, like the prophecy, rejecting the cornerstone.
Yeah.
That was like my conscientious act of rejecting Christ from my life. Wow. And I hid him in this drawer, saying, you know, basically like, I'm done. That was like a decisive decision, a choice of rejecting the Lord.
Wow.
And to this day, I have that image, of course, and I use that same image for my holy card of ordination.
Really? Oh,
yeah,
that's awesome.
Because it's just ever since it's always been something that stirs into flame the love of the Lord, because it just the beauty of his face reflects the revelation of his life and the glory of who he is for us and who we are meant to be in him. And so the image of the holy face, not just that one, but the image of the holy face in general, I think is a powerful devotion for our times.
Welcome back to the Terry and Jesse Show. Father Robert, Carmelite priest, telling us his story of his falling in love with Jesus Christ. Father, statistically, I read this, not maybe even 5 years ago, that by the time a young person, male or female, Catholic, it reaches the age of 23, 87% of them are not practicing their Catholic faith.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Now, I got to ask you this question because it seems to me somewhere, somehow, someone was praying to have the graces for you to really come to know Jesus Christ outside of your own relationship. In other words, outside of you, someone had to be praying for you. Do you know who that person is or was? Or maybe you won't know until you get to heaven.
Right. From my perspective, the person I could attribute it to is Grandma and Grandpa.
I love it.
Especially Grandpa, because the prayers of a man leading the family in faith and prayer. I mean, he like a military sergeant made us pray the rosary every night.
Really?
Oh yeah. Even though for me as a kid, I mean, it was like pulling teeth.
Oh my gosh.
I resented it deeply, but now I absolutely love the rosary of our Blessed Mother. We're full-blooded Portuguese, and I'm first generation. All my family came from the Azores Islands of Terceira.
Wow.
And so Our Lady of Fatima is humongous for our culture, and to this day, I mean, I hope to be worthy of being considered, just a true son of Our Lady of Fatima.
Yes.
And of course, we know that the rosary is humongous part of this message.
Absolutely.
So as a kid, we were forced to pray the rosary. My grandpa was the main one. He was the one leading the ship in that department.
Wow.
And he also, in fact, come to think of it, it just dawned on me, he was also the one that always led the rosary at the Portuguese halls whenever there was big events like the Holy Ghost Festival.
Really?
If you're in California and you know these pockets of Portuguese community, you've heard of the festas and the sopas and all that. So Grandpa, my avô, Francisco Fagundes, she was the one that always led the rosary for the whole Portuguese community of the city of where I grew up. And of course, I didn't pay any mindfulness to that. I didn't appreciate it. But he also was very devoted to the prayers of Saint Bridget.
Sure.
The very, it's a big commitment, those prayers.
Big time.
But the promises are profound. And if I remember right, one of those promises is like the conversion of kids in the family. Yeah, that was really, really huge, especially considering, I come from a broken home and I didn't realize that until much later. And so part of the brokenness of my home life was my parents divorced before I was 2 years old.
Wow.
And after the age of 2.5, I no longer saw my father at all.
Wow.
And I didn't lay eyes on him until after my conversion, which immediately followed a Carmelite vocation and entering the Carmel. And so God did this, put me on the fast track of new life, because within a year and a half, I went from just being like a hip hop hippie revolutionary radical in terms of like liberalism and spirituality and all that, to completely falling in love with Jesus Christ.
Awesome.
And discovering a beautiful gift to a Carmelite, to be a Carmelite. And I was within a year and a half within the Carmelite monastery. And all that happened, the conversion, as soon as I had my conversion experience, I was called by the Lord through my stepfather to find my dad, to reconcile with him, which I was able to do with my grandfather's help.
Incredible.
And so that was a big part of the Exodus, and the coming to discover myself was discovering my dad. And so he wasn't around. My dad wasn't around, and I don't blame him for that. God bless him if he ever hears this. But Grandpa was a prayer warrior, and he went to daily mass. He was Eucharistic adoration.
Yeah.
He had his very simple faith from the old country, but a great heart, and I believe that the Lord really honored that. And then that other person, I think, was my stepfather.
Yeah.
My stepfather is a prayer warrior, and I think he really made a difference to bring that about. But I don't think it was my mother or my dad praying for me. I think it was Grandpa, especially.
Yeah.
My stepfather. My grandmother, of course, prayed too.
Yeah.
But I really attribute it to my grandpa and my stepfather, because, again, I mean, we know we don't need to go into the foolishness of thinking that, we believe men are superior to women or something. Of course not. But in regards to the hierarchical order of creation, the patrimony, the fatherhood is humongous.
Of course.
And so the prayers of a dad go a long way to save their children. And so that was definitely part of the providence of God, for sure.
Now, you come from a broken family, but it seems that in America, I've done enough research on this, that we know that if a father practices his faith, about 90% of these children will be practicing their faith. If the father doesn't practice and mom practices, it goes way down to something like 25%. So what advice would you give mom and dad who are listening, saying, I have a son who just doesn't seem engaged at all in his Catholic faith. The world, the devil, and the flesh seems to be such a prominent influence. How can I help him come to Jesus Christ?
Well, the first thing is we men need to man up. We need to discover the gift of our masculinity and the power of who we're called to be as leaders and fathers. I mean, there's no greater gift than to be a father.
That's right.
There really isn't. I mean, as for men, there's no greater gift than being a father.
Yeah.
And that's our greatest legacy, and so it's so easy for men who are called to the married life to be consumed by the stress and the responsibility of making money and careerism and all of that. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's the quality of a man's fatherhood that makes the difference in their child's life, not their ability to provide financially, which of course is a huge weight on a man's shoulders, and it's necessary, but that's not what makes the difference. And so if a father is manning up in regards to being a man, which begins with like getting on one's knees, being man enough to bow before the God-man, and to commit and consecrate your manhood, your responsibility of manhood to Christ, the King of glory, and allow Jesus to show us what it means to be a man and a father. That's key. Yeah. And I think the more men do that, it transforms our church. It transforms our families. It's not a bulletproof vest. I know good men who are very practicing and very prayerful, who also have kids that, are pretty callous in the faith. Yeah. It's not a bulletproof vest. Yeah. But it's part of the signs of the times. Going back to Our Lady of Fatima, our Blessed Mother knew that there was going to be this apostasy of faith. Yes. And so this is part of the demonic age that we live in. And that being the case, wives, pray for your husband's protection. Intercede, pray with sacrifice, with fasting for your husbands, because they're being targeted more than you women, more than you wives. They're being targeted more. Because if the enemy can wipe out the soul, the fire of faith in a man's heart, of a father's heart, then he has access to the family.